History 101, Lecture 2, Rise of Europe. Uh, right now we're going to talk about the Renaissance and the Reformation, and then some other minor developments. And remember, all these parts you're looking at are for the test in week 5. You're going to look at what are significant developments in the rise of Europe. And so we're going over different developments that aided in the rise of Europe. You're welcome to kind of come up with other ideas as well, but these are kind of the main ones if you'd like, and you can kind of follow along and discuss them. So, the Renaissance. What is the Renaissance? The Renaissance is a period of European history, roughly between the 11th and 16th centuries, where historians look at these roughly 5 centuries between 1000 AD and 1500 AD, and look at Europe as a kind of a rebirth of learning in Western Europe. So the argument being that during this period, Europe reconnected with its trading networks. It reconnected culturally with its cultural past of ancient Greece and Rome. And also we have some technological development as well that allows Western Europeans to go out and sell the world. Okay. What we need to be concerned with for to get to the age of exploration is Europe needs sailing technology. For most Europeans back in this period, 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, 10th century, 1,000 years ago, for most Europeans, water travel was mainly on rivers of Europe and then the Mediterranean Sea, which is generally a lot calmer than the Atlantic Ocean. Really, you really only have, the Vikings obviously knew how to sail the Atlantic. The British, the English, the Irish, Scottish, they kind of knew as well because they're sitting out in the Atlantic. But for most Europeans, the Mediterranean Ocean and the rivers of Europe were the extent of kind of their water travel. So for most European cultures, sailing into the rough waters of the Atlantic was kind of a no-go. Again, the most famous exception would be the Vikings, right? The Vikings raped and pillaged Europe for fun for centuries, for a couple centuries, and so you have, so they're good at it, but most aren't. So we need Europe to get sailing technology, and so we have the caravel, the compass, the astrolabe, the lateen sail, and the cannon. These are main inventions or perfections of inventions that we're going to see developed. The caravel is a type of a ship where you don't need a galley. You don't need to have a bunch of slaves rowing the boat, which is a galley. You have this caravel boat. It operates with wind power, so you don't need people rowing it. The compass tells direction, north, south, east, and west. The astrolabe is a nautical instrument that tells you how far north or south of the equator you are. Then you have a lateen sail. What a lateen sail is a triangular sail. The original caravel is developed in the 13th century. Did not have a movable mast. The mast where the sails were on couldn't move. Lateen sail, the triangular sail, with a boom that you could move. The boom is the bottom arm of a sail, and so you've heard the phrase "lower the boom." That's referring to that. This nautical term of if you don't like the wind direction, you can move your sail. The mast moves, so you can move it around, and so lower the boom means you're moving the mast to a different part of the ship, so that and tying it down to the edge of the ship so that you can take advantage of wind power. Okay. Then we're going to see the development of the cannon, and that's definitely a military use for that. The next section we're going to talk about is the Reformation. Okay. What is important? Why do we need to study the Reformation? The Reformation, when we get to colonial America, you need to understand why there's different types of Christian denominations. Why not everyone's Catholic, right? There are major religious groups in colonial America that we'll talk about. The Puritans, the Quakers, two big ones. And so we have to understand the development of the Reformation because it will help us understand colonial American culture and even American religion today. Even the next thing is, in a minute, we're going to talk about a guy named Calvin. Calvin had a specific theology that's very popular in colonial America. And so one reason we want to know about the Reformation is to help understand colonial American culture. You really need to understand kind of the theology of where they're coming from theologically or religiously. And so we want to study Calvin because Calvin is extremely popular as a theology during this period. So what is the definition of the Reformation? We're talking about Western Europe, so places like what will become Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, France, Spain, the Netherlands. So Western Europe, so that part of Europe. In the 16th and 17th centuries, so this should be the 1500s. So this should be after Columbus lived, the 1600s. The first guy we want to talk about is Luther. Luther is a German theology professor. He teaches at a German university. He teaches theology. Martin Luther came to have two problems. Well, he started out with two problems, right? He eventually had at least 95 problems, but he started out with two problems with the Catholic Church. It grew to 95, the famous 95 thesis, but Luther comes to have a lot of issues with the Catholic Church. And number one is this idea of indulgences. Indulgences is a Catholic doctrine during the time period that you could buy extra works of the saints that had died previously. So the theological idea is that the saints, like St. Peter, St. Mary, St. Bartholomew, whatever, all these saints, the idea is that these saints had done enough good works that they had leftover works. They did more than they needed for salvation. So the idea of an indulgence is the church could give you an indulgence, which means so you could get some extra credit, get some extra works from somebody else, from a saint like St. Peter, and that could help you get into heaven. Okay? By the time of Luther's day, the church was selling these certificates that granted salvation. As originally understood, the idea of indulgences was you had to be worthy. It was just a matter of, just in case I didn't do quite enough, By the time we get to Luther's time period, the church had started selling these, selling indulgences, and so you getting an indulgence was based less on whether you were worthy, but or whether you had the money to pay for enough good works, I guess. The second issue that Martin Luther comes to have with the Catholic Church is that salvation. For the Catholic Church of the time period, salvation was accomplished through performing the works of the Church. Martin Luther comes to believe that salvation, or what is salvation? Being saved from sin and death, going to hell basically. So freedom, salvation from sin and death. You die, so you'll get resurrected, and in sin, you'll go to hell. And so the argument from that time period, from Luther's point of view, is salvation is achieved through faith, not by performing the works of the church, but by having faith in Jesus Christ. So that's going to become a big contention. And as I mentioned a minute ago, these two issues eventually will grow to 95 and then some. Martin Luther will eventually be excommunicated from the Catholic Church. His followers will create a new religious denomination called Lutheranism. Okay, so Lutheran Church is a theology. It's Martin Luther's theology. It's also a specific denomination. Okay. These groups of Europeans, like Lutherans and others, that were protesting the Catholic Church, get another name called Protestants, Protestants, right? So these Protestants, Lutheran and others, are going to be protesting the Catholic Church, protesting its political power, its religious power, spiritual power, the ability to kind of control the affairs of Europe. And even, the Pope had an army. Medieval Europe, the Pope had an army. So politically, militarily, economically. So these Europeans, like Luther and others, are challenging the supremacy or the strength of the Catholic Church at the time period. The next guy we got to look at is, we had Martin Luther. We now have to know about John Calvin. Okay, John Calvin was a Swiss theologian. He lived in Switzerland. He lived around the same time as Martin Luther. Okay, Calvin liked Martin Luther. He liked his ideas. Calvin is going to, however, go on and develop his own theology called Calvinism. Okay. Calvinism becomes extremely popular in colonial America. And so this is why it may seem boring, but this is important because it's colonial American religious culture. And there's even when you study current day American religion, American Christianity, Calvinism is still a big part of it. And so Calvinism for U.S. history is an extremely important theology to understand. It helps you understand the culture of colonial America, and even in some ways, modern American religious culture. Right? There are 5 ideas. There's 5 theological points or ideas in Calvinism. It's called the tulip. Okay, and they each kind of give us some ideas of what colonial Americans are thinking. And, as we're going through this, kind of you kind of think about, what, if I believe these things, if I think these things, maybe you do and maybe you don't, but kind of think about it. What would be my behavior throughout the day, or what would I think if these were my ideas? Number 1, total depravity of man. To put in layman's terms, man is sinful. Okay? Human beings are sinful by nature. Human beings are bad. Have you guys ever had a philosophy class where there was a debate about, are human beings naturally good or naturally evil? In Calvinism, human beings are naturally evil. Man is sinful. Okay, human beings are evil. If God and the devil were standing right in front of you, you'd choose the devil. Okay, total depravity of mankind. Next idea, unmerited grace. What is grace? Grace is God's saving power. In other words, what keeps you from going to hell? God's grace. And so, for Calvin, you don't earn that grace. That's unmerited grace. No works are capable of salvation. Again, salvation from what? Sin, going to hell, and death. Christ died, and so you'll be resurrected. You'll get your body back in a glorified form. And so, for Calvin, just like Luther, you can't gain salvation from sin and death, going to hell and never having your body again. You can't do that through works. It's unmerited grace. Okay? The idea is the only thing that saves you is God wants to. He has grace and wants to. Limited atonement. Only the elect are saved. And so, when Christ died on the cross, who did he die for? Okay, and just to give you some ideas, what that means, you could think when when Christ suffered in the Garden of Gethsemane and died on the cross, who did he do it for? Did he do it for everyone that ever lived? And that happens to be what I think, but did he die for everyone that ever lived? Right? Everyone that ever lived? Did he die for just Christians? Okay. Did he die just for Christians? Calvinists go even further. Christ only died for the elect. Okay. So a much smaller group. Okay. And so limited atonement. The atonement is Christ suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane and his being crucified on the cross for our sins so that what? We wouldn't have to go to hell and we'd get our bodies back, right? In an immortal, glorified form. Irresistible grace. Okay, what this means is the elect won't reject God. In other words, so if you have nothing to do with your salvation and only God can save you, that can create some anxiety for you. And so the Calvinist argument is irresistible grace. If God has elected you, you won't reject God. Okay. And then predestination. It's also called perseverance of the believers. Okay. What this means is your eternal destination is determined before birth. Before you were born, God had an election. There was no voter fraud. Voter ID was used. Only one voter, God. He had an election, and he elected some of you to go to heaven. And some of you are not going to heaven. Some of you are going to hell. So the idea of predestination in Calvinism is God has determined your eternal destination. And so if God elected you, if you're the elect, if God elected you, you're going to go to heaven, no matter what you do. If God did not pick you, go to hell. Right? And so you have predestination as the idea of God choosing the elect. All right. Calvinism is also called Reformed theology. So if you're ever reading and you see that term, Reformed theology, that's what that is. Okay. So again, Calvinism extremely important to understanding colonial American history when we get to it. And the next person we want to talk about is Henry VIII. Henry VIII, I am. Henry VIII, I am. Right? And so Henry VIII is a king of England in the 1520s and 30s. Henry VIII, he's a good Catholic. How good of a Catholic, Mr. Bills? Henry VIII, when Martin Luther was running around saying his things, Henry VIII wrote pamphlets and letters defending the Catholic Church against Martin Luther. It earned Henry VIII a new title, Defender of the Faith. Okay, and so you have a king that's an extremely good Catholic. He gets a title, Defender of the Faith. Okay. Henry VIII is married to a Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon. Okay. A little bit of an insight into medieval Spaniards, medieval Spanish culture. One historian described the Spaniards as more Catholic than the Pope. Okay. So Queen Catherine of Aragon, okay, is a Spanish princess. She's Spanish. So I'll let you contemplate how Catholic she is. She's extremely Catholic. A medieval historian, or a historian of medieval Europe, pointed out once in his book on medieval Europe, the Spaniards are more Catholic than the Pope. That's loyal. They are loyal. Okay. I'll give you another example. Guess what did not happen in Spain? The Protestant Reformation. Okay. This period right now that we're talking about, the Protestant Reformations in England, France, Holy Roman Empire, Spain had the Spanish Inquisition. So that tells you how Catholic they are. There's not a Protestant Reformation in Spain. They have the Spanish Inquisition. Okay. So they're not having any of this Protestant Luther and Calvin stuff, right? So Henry VIII and Catherine are married. Okay. Um, Catherine is not a good wife. What's her bad thing? She hasn't given a son. She hasn't borne a son to Henry VIII, and so that's upsetting. So what does Henry VIII do? Henry VIII wants a divorce from Catherine. So in his argument is, so I can marry someone and have a male heir, right? So he writes a letter to the Pope asking for a divorce. He has his eye on somebody, Anne Boleyn, a lady in waiting to Catherine of Aragon, right? So Henry VIII is impatient. So while the letter is coming back, he becomes impatient. He forces the Bishop of Canterbury um, to give him a divorce between him and Catherine, forces him to marry him and Anne Boleyn, and he puts Catherine in the Tower of London. Excellent. All right. So Catherine's shipped out to the Tower of London prison, and he gets a divorce he forces the cardinal in Great Britain and England to grant him a divorce and then marry him to Anne Boleyn. The letter comes back. You cannot have a divorce. Whoops. So, what does Henry VIII do? He just declares himself the head of the church in England. And after that, he gives himself a divorce. So Henry VIII starts a new church called the Anglican Church, or the Church of England. Okay, so you have the Church of England now forming. You're going to want to keep this in mind, because when we get to another lecture, we're going to talk about a group of people who want to purify the Anglican Church of its Catholicism. Okay, and so that's a very important thing to get, is Henry VIII, the Anglican Church, even decades later, looks very Catholic, because Henry VIII wasn't worried about the theology, he just wanted a divorce. So, theology can be whatever. And so when we get to a few decades later, we're going to see a group of people who have a problem with that theology. Okay, so you're going to want to keep Henry VIII and the Anglican Church in mind for later as well. Closing out this video, we have some minor developments like the end of the bubonic plague. Traditionally, it's called the Black Death. We live in more politically correct times, so we would prefer to call it by its medical term, the bubonic plague, which is what it is. It's the medieval Europeans didn't know what the disease was, so they called it the Black Death. We call it the bubonic plague. We have better map making, the return to classical learning. Ancient Greeks and Romans, a lot of the ancient Greeks and Romans literature, that's in the Middle East and Rome, and so a lot of it gets lost. Also, when Catholicism took over, it kind of stamped out all these pagan Roman and Greek writers. So with the return to classical learning during this period, the 11th to the 15th century, you see Europeans getting more interested in their cultural roots, which are ancient Greek and ancient Roman literature and philosophy and religion and law and all that stuff. I'm going to give you a hint. Okay, the ancient Greeks and Romans thought the world was round. Okay, so I'm going to leave that in your head for later. But ancient Greeks and Romans thought the world was round. Okay, the ending of serfdom in Western Europe, I talked about that. And then we have the ending of outside threats. In Islam ends. So the Ottoman Turks, the Holy Roman Empire gets its act together by the 15th century, and stops the Ottoman Turks from advancing into Europe, or Western Europe. In 1492, Spain successfully kicks out the last Muslim Moors, ending their 7th century long Reconquista. So you end those outside threats, you stop the Ottoman Turks from expanding, and you kick out the Ottoman Moors that have taken over and dominated for the last 7 centuries. What do you do with the Vikings? You Christianize them. By the 12th century, a lot of these Viking clans and families have become Christian. And what's the first thing you tell them after you baptize them? You cannot rape and pillage Europe. Okay, so you're going to have to find another hobby. Football, for example. Go play football or something. But so you Christianize the Vikings, and the first rule is you can't rape and pillage other Christian Europeans, and so you got to find another hobby. And so the Vikings, I'm sure, are a little upset at first. They're like, "Dang it!" Until they found out what football was, and everything's okay. And so those are a bunch of developments in Europe that you could possibly write about.